looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. When it comes to glamorizing misery, murder and suffering, there is no better filter than Hollywood. Seriously, whatever your fascination and emotional investment in serial killers, and many people have a deep level of absorption in the miscreants of society, it's hard to argue that the commercialization, fetishizing and gift wrapping of heinous acts of cruelty is a business model to revere. Netflix is currently taking this lionizing to a whole new degree with its in-depth documentaries and poring over the worst crimes of humanity in acute forensic detail. The point here is murder is horrible and there's nothing to really get excited about when we're talking about the death of small babies or the torture of people before they are being dismembered and buried. But like everything in life, from football to baking shows, it's how it's sold to people. The Americanization and glamming up of serial killers is nothing new. It's been done for decades, right back to when we got Psycho, through films like Manhunter, and into the 90s with The Silence of the Lambs and Seven. It even goes into modern day TV shows like Dexter, True Detective, and recent movies such as The Little Things. Either way, serial killers have been polished through gritty dramatizations, and many real-life serial killers such as John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and, in my country, the United Kingdom, people such as Peter Sutcliffe and Fred and Rose West have all had dramatizations or in-depth documentaries. So for today's video, I want to look at serial killers and specifically two different types and how they are portrayed on screen. We'll look at what the names denote, how their psychology affects them, and in the end, how Hollywood processes these so that the gratuitous topic of psychopaths ends up as something with almost a rock star sheen and a heavy dose of artificial flavourings which can make it more palatable. Now, this is a two-part video, so today we're going to look at one of our two categories. And our categories are the disorganised killer and the organised killer. So for today's video, part one, we're going to look at the organised killer. And then in part two, we'll get severely disorganised. Oh, and we're going to be talking about child abuse, torture, and sexual assault. So if these are triggering words for you, that's your final warning. Right then, let's crack on and look at the organised killer. Now, for today's video, there'll be some extraneous and extra movies thrown in here and there, but for the base source of our recipe, we're going to focus on Francis Dollarhide from the 2002 movie Red Dragon. In our next video, The Disorganised Killer, we'll look at our three favourite masked sadists from the two Strangers movies. Now, before we start, and to allay any comments, I'm taking Red Dragon over its predecessor Manhunter because whilst I think both films have their merits, Red Dragon has an overall better cast, and by using Anthony Hopkins' Lecter, it adds a touch more glamour and relevance to the finished product. Okay, so what is an organised killer? Well, according to an article on Psycholotron, the organised killer is in control. Their crimes generally show evidence of careful planning. They will have thought about the attack extensively before carrying it out, and they may have taken time to select a specific victim. Organised killers choose locations where they will not be disturbed. They like to torture their victims, and in most cases with this subtype of killer, their victims are bound. Organised killers are experts at removing forensic evidence, and more often than not, they like to take a trophy home with them. Psychology Today further added to this description, stating that when it comes to the organised killer, they are fascinated not just with the actual homicide itself, but the process of how the homicide will be conducted, carried out, and then ultimately exited. In other words, the murder is one thing, but the mind lights up at the procedure and method of it. Now, we know that some serial killers are psychopaths. Woodworth and Porter deemed in a study that 20% of serial killers are classified as psychopaths, but a lot of other factors go into making a serial killer or homicidal individual. In Red Dragon, Francis Dollarhide was born with a cleft palate and then endured years of systematic abuse and torture from people who should have been caring for him. His grandmother physically and psychologically abused him and humiliated him, and when she got dementia, he ended up back with his estranged mother and stepfather, and then is further abused not only by these people, but also his step-siblings. Red Dragon doesn't really give enough to Dollarhide's backstory in its runtime, but as Edward Norton states at one point at the end of the movie, I read his journals, and it was so sad. He wasn't born a monster. He was made this way by years of systematic abuse. However, Dollarhide's abuse has a strange and iatrogenic outcome of his predilection for violence, and that is, it makes him fastidious, forensically minded, and ultra careful in terms of his crimes. Dollarhide is a brilliant example of an organised killer, and one who, whilst he shows psychopathic tendencies, isn't necessarily a psychopath. And part of the reason is because he is forged by his abuse rather than just being born with a biological abnormality, and the repeated humiliation and physical torture he endures creates something which is really important: his personality. Now, as I have discussed in my videos in the past, personality is the pattern of characteristics across the entire matrix of the persona, and you become you through your experiences, nurtures, traumas, and milestone moments of achievements, happiness, or misery, and these experiences ultimately shape the nervous, or confident, or reticent, or frigid, or arrogant, or whatever type of person you now are. And one such outcome for someone who has suffered immense trauma in their childhood is called latent vulnerability. But what is latent vulnerability? Latent vulnerability refers to how neurocognitive and biological systems adapt to adverse environments in ways that may confer short-term functional advantages but increase the risk of poor psychiatric outcomes. In other words, latent vulnerability refers to the way which people react in their phenomenal fields of reality, which help keep the subject safe from harm, but limits their interactions, development, and can leave them appearing challenging or just sometimes odd to other people, and thus, in the long term, creates more personality deficits. The presence of latent vulnerability in itself does not mean that a future psychiatric disorder is inevitable, but one thing it does do is affect how the individual will cope in the outside world. One such side effect of latent vulnerability is how people feel when they go into situations which require interactions and colloquial trade-offs. So, for example, school, work, or even just a small gathering of people causes immense distress because social cues and norms, perceptive altitudes, and the fear of imminent humiliation all cause immense levels of distress. Abused children end up in situations which we all do and we all find familiar. However, for them, these familiar situations which are normal to us set off reactions and alarm bells for them, and because of these alarm bells, they react in ways which cause rejection or make them submissive to more mistreatment. Okay, back to Dollarhide. Dollarhide has lived in his family estate alone for years, but works for a company called Gateway Corp in the home movies editing division. Dollarhide is a quiet individual, and he's seen as weird and odd to his co-workers, but like many serial killers, he flies beneath their radar because he is so unremarkable, and he generally keeps himself to himself so that he doesn't arouse any overt attention. His latent vulnerability has surely left him a virgin, friendless, and also very angry, but he is also afflicted by a severe mental illness where he believes he is now transmogrifying into the great red dragon, and even has a tattoo of said beast all over his back. What's interesting about Dollarhide is that his experiences of fighting for his life in a family of abusers has, unlike the strangers we're going to come to in part 2, left him with a very keen sense of survival. And this isn't uncommon when we're talking about victims of perpetual abuse, because they live in a state called hyper-arousal. Imagine if every day you were beaten, raped, starved, all because you may have done something like accidentally wet your bed or just looked at someone the wrong way. You would be in a state of constant fear, and that doesn't leave you as you grow up. It stays with you. It changes, but it stays with you. So Dollarhide may not be a psychopath, but his family were a conglomeration of sadists and sociopaths who would torture him for his enuresis, or bedwetting, and humiliate him for his appearance. Now, if your child wets the bed, what's the first thing that you'd do? You'd offer condolences, make them feel okay, and support them, because accidents happen. They happen to many of us, and even as a child, it's embarrassing when you wake up and you've wet the bed. However, for Dollarhide, he gets beaten, humiliated, and his grandmother threatens to cut off his penis because he's now a dirty boy. Therefore, as he grows up with his trauma, repressed emotivity, and latent vulnerability, he becomes hypersensitive to threats in the world. One positive about this is Dollarhide's dedication to fitness and strength and being a bodybuilder, so he isn't the puny little boy who was tortured for years anymore. Another facet is, and this one is more useful for his murderous predilections, he has a near forensic attention to detail. Now, this is because he lived a life where he was tortured for no reason and had to remain quiet and withdrawn, so something in his latent vulnerability carries on in later life as he is quiet in work, and the fact that he has to always clean up after himself when he was young and wetting the bed makes sure that now, when he commits acts, he is now careful and cleaning up the scenes that he commits crimes in. So Dollarhide's personality, almost accidentally, has formed a personality called obsessive-compulsive type. Now, this is not to be confused with OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, as this is instead a personality disorder. So obsessive-compulsive personality can have some of these facets: a preoccupation with details, rules, and organisation, shows perfectionism to the point that it interferes with task completion, is excessively devoted to work to the exclusion of leisure activities, is unable to discard worn out or worthless items, and has a mental structure that is rigid and stubborn. Dollarhide has to be attentive to details because if he wasn't when he was young, he got beaten and hurt. Dollarhide then ensures that this attention and perfectionism to detail enables him to study his victims' home movies and thus learn every detail about them because he has a mind that is engineered towards perfectionist thinking. He is excessively devoted to his work. Okay, it's delusional because he feels he's both becoming and being berated by the great red dragon, which lives as a full-bodied hallucination inside his head, but he also hears the voices of his abusers inside his head, and so, to make sure he doesn't make any mistakes, as a mistake gets you hurt, he studies the tapes night after night, and, even when his new blind girlfriend comes round, he continues to study the tapes even whilst getting a blowjob. So Dollarhide is now a loner with no social activities, and his house is filled with past relics which are now nothing but token memories of the pain he once suffered. So yes, there are sexual predilections about killing the Lees and Jacobi families, more on that later, but his crippling mental illness, where he hears voices and sees images, and his latent vulnerability from his systematic abuse all combine to form a remarkably intelligent and thoughtful killer who doesn't do anything random or out of order. Dollarhide studies the videos for days. After all, he's going to change his victims from human into something else, and he'll even sit in trees opposite the house for endless days and watch what his victims are doing. He learns every forensic detail about his victims, so when he goes in, it goes perfectly as planned, and then he can bind, incapacitate, and torture his victims so they cannot move. His victims are shot, not always fatally, and he inserts mirrors into the eyes of the corpses so they look alive while they're watching him do his rather unpleasant things to the women. Even his murder scene is organised, with the whole family lined up and watching as he does really grotesque things to the matriarch of the family. Dollarhide is partly undone because he has to touch an eyeball, something Will Graham works out, but overall he's a master of removing forensic detail from his scene. The same can be said for John Doe of 7, where he has planned his murders for what seems like years and always leaves the police with nothing. Now, we know nothing about John Doe's past, but he likely follows the same isolative path as Dollarhide, where he learned to live via experience, and his own experiences enabled him to become smarter and more efficient at killing. There is a saying, after all, a very famous saying, that goes, "Damaged people are dangerous because they know how to survive." And this is really true when it comes to Dollarhide and Doe. For Dollarhide, he had to learn how to be invisible and to clean up after himself, such as urine-soaked bedsheets, or he got a beating. And once his cleft palate was fixed and his face resembled something more normal, withdrawing into the crowds was made even easier for him. Look at how his colleagues in the video editing rooms act. They are loud, brash, flirty and coarse, but Dollarhide is gentle and withdrawn and slides in and out of scenes with hardly anyone noticing. Okay, he's far from gentle and withdrawn when putting bits of broken glass into his victim's eyes or masturbating over a corpse, but when it comes to his day-to-day work, the organised killer's mind doesn't just shut off. It's constantly checking that they remain unnoticed, or researching another victim, or learning about police procedures, or ensuring that every detail is covered for when their next murder happens. Dollarhide checks the home movies to such a forensic detail that he even knows what type of lock is on each door and what time people go to bed. He gets this by sitting in the tree, so when he does break in, his crimes are quick, succinct, and there is no room for errors. Even his excessive bodybuilding is all part of a contingency plan so that not only will he never be pushed around again like he was as a child, but should an altercation arise, if something goes wrong or something unexpected happens, he's strong enough to win any surprise fistfight. Everything about Dollarhide's personality is scrupulous, meticulous, and when it comes to the bedroom killing and torture, he is exactly like the description at the start of this video. He may not always bind his victim, but he will shoot them to maim and not to kill, because he wants them alive for that short period where he can be dominant and see their suffering. Love and violence have been sadly confused for the young Dollarhide as a boy, so, now a fully grown adult, love and violence remain equally mixed up. He didn't experience any tenderness or love as a child, so when his adult sexual desires overwhelm him and he is battered by a hurricane of mental illness and a warped personality from pervasive trauma, his gestures of love will be detached, cruel, impersonal, and equally violent. Like I said, we carry into adulthood what we know in childhood, and for Dollarhide, love and violence were very meshed up. So therefore, as we get older, it remains very much the same. It might change and become more projected, but love and violence remain very much a coagulation and a mess. In the UK, we've had many organised serial killers. Fred and Rose West blended into society whilst killing a believed total of 30 people. Lucy Letby, a recent serial killer who was arrested, murdered 8 babies while being the most helpful person to both staff and families whilst the horror of babies dying was unfolding on her ward. After all, a nurse cannot kill her patient without some kind of focus and attention to detail, because not only is murder in a confined space going to cause a reaction, but the exact amount of medication you need to give to someone, how you give it to them, and how you get away with it because of the way the body metabolizes these chemicals is very important. And killers like John Wayne Gacy in the United States were also organised because he blended into his community despite keeping an enormous body count under his house. Organised killers are deemed to have a high level of intelligence, and whilst their field of victims may well be as narrow as the disorganised, after all, Dollarhide can only kill the people he studied via videotape, and a disorganised killer, like the Strangers, can only kill stragglers or people in secluded locations. The organised killer is a remarkable piece of mental engineering. Dollarhide's latent vulnerability comes into something called autobiographical memory, and this refers to the recollection of personally experienced events, and it is thought to play a central role in scaffolding all of our sense of self-esteem and grounding our ability to remain orientated in the present. Now, such would be Dollarhide's vivid experiences. In the film, we even hear the hallucination of his grandmother's voice berating him as a voice inside his head, and this emotion occurs when he's working out and lifting weights, or in other words, when he's angry and emotions are unfettered, or he's releasing stress by a good bodybuilding workout, his memory spills out its intrusive thoughts, and all repression breaks through the facade he locks them down in when acting normally at work, so he can ascertain tapes and thus stalk his victims. And another side of autobiographical memory is recalling periods in time where the person was at risk and how they avoided that risk, and so this also helps his organisation when committing his murderous spree killings. Dollarhide might be overwhelmed and torn down by his "Dirty little beast," grandmother screaming inside his head to the point where he covers his face and relives his trauma. But at times where he needs to raise the more fastidious and obsessive-compulsive traits which keep him collected and enable him to have memories of every detail in the house and the family's routine, his mind's attention to detail of avoiding being abused by his family come in handy. Basically, the way he had to act to analyse, hide, and process things as a child is an autobiographical memory that comes in handy as an adult. So for Dollarhide, he would have been a people watcher, familiarising himself with his abuser's routine, ensuring he kept a low profile, and when he wet the bed or did something to attract unwanted attention, he would have learned quickly how to forensically cover these mistakes, or if he didn't, he would face another beating. It's a form of operant conditioning where certain behaviours get rewards and repeated, whilst other behaviours get bad results and are thus eliminated. Dollarhide's rewards and punishment would have been miles apart, yet actually at the same time and paradoxically quite similar. In other words, a reward for a good boy, like your son for example, might be extra pocket money or a Happy Meal, but for Dollarhide, his reward was simply not getting the crap beaten out of him. It's hardly a reward, but it's better than the alternative, which is actually getting beaten to the point where you can't move. Therefore, with such operant and vicariously arbitrary rewards, attention to detail becomes crucial, and this feeds back into how you form an obsessive-compulsive personality. Most personalities, of course, are formed in childhood, and many of the emotionally unstable, obsessive-compulsive, narcissistic, and so forth are formed between the very young ages and through teenage years. Now, personally, in Red Dragon, I felt Ralph Fiennes was the wrong choice for Dollarhide, and that's not because he's not a good actor, he is, but he was too short, he wasn't really built like a brick toilet house, and he appeared to be too handsome for the role of someone who existed as a whisper amidst the noise of everyday life. The organised killer sounds almost a quite nice term, doesn't it? As if someone kills but then cleans up, tidies the scene and leaves a tip and a review on Google, but it's a far cry from that. Violent, often highly sexually deficient and prone to brutal and unrelenting torture, and their sadism is often unfettered, but in terms of planning their attacks and then cleaning up afterwards, they are not dissociated, and despite whatever thrill or adrenaline rush they may or may not get, their attention to detail is unparalleled, and they can spend an almighty time covering up their crimes. Dollarhide must have spent weeks planning for each family murder spree, and that's a truly unnerving thought because he has a tremendous amount of ability to delay gratification. Many athletes use the phrase focus on the process, not the outcome, as they work towards their targets, and the organised killer has the same philosophy. There's no instant gratification here, and their personalities have control, patience, focus, and tenacity when it comes to acting out. And acting out is a crucial element of the disorganised killer, and it's something we're going to touch on in detail when we do The Strangers in part 2. Now, not all killers wait weeks, and some do act quickly, but their cleanups and escape routes are familiar, and because they might want to kill again, orderliness is next to perfection when it comes to the deed. As I have said before, psychopaths have a resistance to chaos and adrenal surges, but not all killers are psychopaths. The organised killer needs to keep frontal lobe thinking intact. The more primitive parts of our brain, which deal in emotivity and fight, flight, fawn and freeze, often inhibit the more frontal lobes of critical thinking and executive functioning. In other words, when you're rowing with your partner, different parts of your brain come alive and switches flick, so the energy goes into different parts of the body and increases things like cortisol and adrenaline. Yet when we are engaged in critical thinking, analysing and more cerebral activities, our frontal lobes light up. Now, it's hard to be cerebral and focused when your adrenaline is pumping and you've just killed an entire family, so it takes some special brain chemistry to dial down the thrills or nervosity of such an act, and it's why autobiographical memory, emotional detachment, and resistance to chaos is so important. Like I said, Dollarhide isn't a psychopath really, but that doesn't mean he isn't a sadist. However, considering his crippling mental illness, delusions, and chronic loneliness, his mental control at times of acute chaos is quite remarkable. Anyway, that's the organised killer. Next time we'll look at the disorganised killer and how their psychology works. So, until next time, remember that psychology is cool. please like, share and subscribe, or even leave a comment if you want to, or a suggestion for a future video. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
That's the same atrocious aftershave you wore in court.